All right, there. So we're going to start a new unit and chapter. This unit is entitled Melodic and Form Analysis. So we're going to just get started on it. After we discuss these things, we will be getting into composing unit, our final project for the year. So especially as we discuss these aspects of melody, be thinking not only from an analysis point of view, but also from your own creative and compositional point. So this chapter 7, though, beginning on melody analysis. First, we're going to be discussing quite a bit elements of unity and variety and dramatic shape, and what characteristics come together so that a melody is memorable and has a feeling of a narrative to it. And then also sometimes a melody is made up of a small figure called a motif, and how do composers grow on those motifs to build full themes. And then not only from an analysis point of view, but also, as I mentioned, a compositional point of view. So how can we write melodies that have unifying factors, but also have some interesting moments and variety to it? How do we build to a climax and then come back down from it? And how can we take a small little fragment, a motif, and build on it to create a full-blown melody? So analysis and composition. All right, name the composer. Good job. Yes, Mozart. Yes, Mozart is famous for his perfect melodies. So some people that don't quite understand Mozart think of them as being simplistic or repetitive, but those people will grow and mature and will come to the agreement that Mozart's melodies are perfectly balanced and singable, and yet have lots of surprises and twists to them. And understanding Mozart comes with age, experience, and time. So, but even before we delve into the specifics, I'll play this melody again for you. And just what are some things about it that you find engaging? And we will look at it from the viewpoint of what makes it memorable, and then what do we find interesting about it. Music is a temporal art, meaning it goes through time. So after it's done, it's done. We have our auditory memory perhaps to rely on, and one can look at a score, but it is not a visual art, it is an aural art. And so composers have to be very careful when they craft their works that there's enough unity in there, there's enough things to make it so that it creates an effect on the listener, and they remember at least to some extent while they're listening to the piece. But yet you don't want it to be so repetitive or so unifying that it's boring. So you have to create, you can't do the same thing over and over and over again. And then a strong melody is one that kind of builds somewhere to a climactic point and then comes to a point of what we call repose, relaxation, because everything can't be climax, because then there really is no climax. So listen again, and what are some things that makes the melody hang together, but yet create some interest to it? And does Mozart build to any specific moment and then come back down again? All right. So what are some unifying points to this melody? Yes, we have a repeated, there's probably a bunch of different ideas, but there's definitely a repeated idea. And then on the second line, which is the second phrase. So it is, the first is the exact repetition of the idea. And then we even have another repetition in the second phrase, the measure 5. And then he goes up. And so obviously this is also then part of the build. This is a motif, usually less than a measure. And we can think of motifs as being rhythmic in nature, although this one definitely has some pitch elements to it. But so hearing this repeated, and then we depart from it, and then a little unifying but yet variety as he goes up to the step. All right. What are some contrasting elements? Well, for one, when we start out, it's a lot of skipping around. We call that disjunct motion. And then he balances it, but departs from that with the stepwise motion, which we call conjunct. Then it goes back to the skipping. Sort of combines those with those descending thirds, because we get a feeling of, but interspersed with steps. And how does he, over the overall architecture of the melody, does it build to a specific point? Let's listen to the whole thing again. And so we talk about the dramatic shape or how it builds towards something. It doesn't have to be big, huge drama, love, death, hate, revenge. It's just, does it rise and fall? So more unifying because it's just a repeat, and then a high note. And then building. And so I would actually say measure 7, even though that D there is not the highest note in the piece, the G is right before it. Because when it starts to come down, being on a strong beat, some different thoughts to how it all goes together. So we're going to, as you might recall from the very beginning, we talked about music theory as giving a vocabulary. So we see if we can put a vocabulary to those things that we noted about the melody. So I'm going to give you a second to read through this page, and then I will join you. So like all things beautiful, it's in the eye of the beholder. A good melody, a characteristic melody, a memorable melody, those mean different things for different people. So speaking in sort of general terms when we talk about really qualities of a good melody. But I think that, again, because it's temporal and moves through time, we do have this element of unity that we need to not be having new ideas every single measure, because that's just too much information for the listener to comprehend. So, but then again, as I mentioned before, you don't want it to be boring. So, and this idea of a meaningful melody, maybe for different people, but it has a beginning to it, then it moves forward, and then it ends just like a narrative. So they have this idea of building towards something and then coming down. Not every melody, maybe a melody starts out right away with not really a beginning, but just strong at the very outset. But that would be, interest, and that would be probably a departure from the norm. So we can still make some generalizations here. So what are those characteristics that give a melody its direction, shape, and continuity? Creates tension, but then repose, which means relaxation or release of the tension. And how about expectations and arrival? We could say the same thing here if we're talking about writing a play or any sort of a narrative, that poetry, prose. These are some of the elements you would use for those works of art as well. So our vocabulary will include contour, intervallic structure, range tessitura, and rhythmic motifs. So I will go ahead and move on. All right. So the shape of the melody is the contour, and we're looking at the pitch levels. So we have 5 different shapes that we want to be able to attach words to. The most prevalent contour is one that we call the arc. It builds pitch-wise to a high point and then levels off. And notice it's not the exact center in this particular short melodic idea, but about 2/3 of the way through. And that's kind of characteristic because you don't want as much repose or relaxation at the end that as you did towards the buildup. This reminds us of perhaps of harmonic progressions because the same thing works when that's what we call it the phrase model, because you're in the tonic area and things are pretty just kind of moving sideways a bit, and then we build with the predominant, the dominant, and then back to the tonic area. An inverse arc, we'll listen to all these. An inverse arc is one where the climax of the phrase is actually perhaps the lowest note or one of the lower notes. So that, of course, much more rare than because a rise in pitch usually creates a rise in intensity. We could have one where the whole melody just seems to be generally moving up, and I include this word ramp in here. And a ramp is one where you have a short pattern that repeats and is at sort of a different pitch level, and the descending ramp. So you see this goes down, that goes down, that goes down. And there's a real variety to all of these ideas. So these will play right after each other. All right, so that builds. Here's Joy to the World, a marimba. English horn. And the descending contour with the viola. Okay, so not a classic sort of melody there. Okay, so those are 4 of the 5. And then number 5, static. No contour at all, just kind of hanging around, a central pitch. So too much unity there, perhaps, and boring. Notice that melodies will not always be one or the other. They can have elements of all. So look, Twinkle Star has a 2-measure idea that builds and then relaxes as far as the pitch levels. Then it comes down in 2 steps. Then that repeats, and then we have the beginning arc again. Some people would say that each of these 2-measure ideas is a phrase. Well, that's for a different day. Again, not a classic melody. Thank you, Mr. Tuba. So that was the idea of contour. The second idea is the intervallic structure. Perhaps this could be referred to as the melodic motion. But here we're talking about how the composer uses intervals within the melody to create unity, variety, and maybe build towards a climax. Conjunct, the stepwise motion, and that's all seconds. And then disjunct is anything greater than a second. So either you were skipping spaces of the scale, or just going right through the scale part. So before we listen to this Wagner, most melodies do you think are going to be more conjunct or disjunct? And our sense of melody comes from our long tradition of singing. So which is easier to sing? Notes that go by steps or with lots of skips? And what creates a little bit more variety or interest in a melody? All right. And we get some little Italiano here as well. Molto vigoroso e tenuto. So vigorous but yet smooth. Molto moderato. Okay, so very medium tempo. This is very Wagnerian. So we're given this idea of a disjunct motion here, the deep of the descending fourth, and then the same note, and then conjunct, back down, and then a little bit of a, well, that's not a jump, but then here's a repeat of the fourth, except up a step, and then stepwise motion to the end. So where's the climax of the piece? How is it approached? And what kind of variety is used through combining by the use of the intervallic structure? This again. Right, so the climax is probably the highest note here. So we can see from the contour of the line that it just visually shapes. We get a nice, exciting beginning, and then things mellow out. Stepwise motion tends to be more of a unifying and moment of repose, but then it builds with the pitch, with the contour. And then this is actually the same melody, but the second phrase begins with that same descending fourth to grab our attention again, creating contrast, and also building excitement because it's up, but we don't quite have the same amount of climax as we do. This goes on and on for a longer phrase for the second half of the melody. So we want a melody that's cohesive and with the meaning. Then a strong melody would tend to proceed smoothly and avoid the leaps and awkward intervals. So just the contrast and the balance there. So which of these, so as we go through the analysis or you're thinking about your own melodies, is this going to be more of a, these are things that are unifying factors in melody. So mostly, most melodies are going to be conjunct, and then maybe 20% are going to be, like, they're going to be the variation of that. So good intervals always. So these are our rules from voice leading, right? We talked about these guidelines when we started voice leading. So these should be familiar to you. And so we will move on. And then a twofer. So melodic range is sort of related to, kind of related to contour, and that we're talking about pitch. But this is about looking at the overall range of the entire melody from the beginning to end and saying if it has a narrow range or if it has a larger type range. So we do want to keep that in mind. We know that for voice leading, which is essentially chorale writing, that we say within an octave, and melodic sort of would be about an octave and a half, but you don't want a melody within just the melody itself to be, too wide, because that's too much information, but then too narrow and it's boring. And when we're talking about dramatic shape and a little bit into the idea of timbre, tessitura. Tessitura is the range of a specific instrument or voice part. So, and how a composer would use that to create tension or repose. So an example here is, let's say the note middle C. So if the composer chose to have a melody kind of surrounded around that, how would it sound if the second sopranos were singing that middle C? And then how would it be if it were a bass section. So for the bass, middle C, C1 is the upper, we call it the tessitura, or the register is another word for when you're talking about uniquely to a specific instrument or voice part. So it's the lower tessitura for a mezzo-soprano, but middle C would be an upper tessitura for a bass. Right, and idea of rhythmic motif. So motif or motive, both are interchangeable. This is the kind of the older style of the word. It's actually maybe a little more used, but motive is used in writing, and it is a motivating, the raison d'etre perhaps, when we talk about bigger melodic works. So more on that later. It's a short figure that provides unity in music. It's really not a building structure. Phrases are the smallest building structure, but it's one that we can create a melody from. You can take a short motif and you can repeat it. You can do a variation on it. You can expand it, sequence it, which we'll already be discussing. And then it can become a full melody because a motif is usually less than a measure in length. And it's a hook. And very often motifs are rhythmic. We could talk about famous melodic motifs, but if you're looking in generic works, probably a repeated pattern that seems to be a unifying factor is just rhythmic. If a melody has recurring rhythmic idea that creates coherence, then we theorize a rhythmic motif is present. But just note, not all melodies have a motif, but those melodies elevate to the status of a theme, usually are made from a catchy, memorable motif. So a musical theme is a melody that is of higher ranking than just any old melody. It's one that a whole piece might be built around. And a first movement work from a symphony is often centered around two different, the A theme and the B theme. So, and those usually have to be memorable so that when it comes back again towards the end, we recognize that if it's developed in the middle, etc. But not all music necessarily has a motif. Great quality music can be built around other unifying factors as well. So just keep that in mind. So let's look at each of these quickly. Here's Mozart. So what consider the contour? Right? We'll listen to it before we answer. Is it prevalent motion, meaning the intervallic structure or the melodic motion? Is it mainly stepwise or skips? You notice we're concentrating just on the upper notes here. It doesn't have to, melody doesn't have to be up there, but it often is. Is there a rhythmic idea that seems to repeat? Okay, so not really a full melody, that's just a phrase. Give you another listen. All right, so it's a rising ramp contour, I would say. And then the second half of the melody actually is the build down to that. So it's stepwise motion. We have this, but there's a pretty big leap here, a smaller leap here of just third, but stepwise. Okay, so there's some both unity and variety in that. The range, it only barely goes below, so it's about an octave. Just a couple little turn below that. And I would say there is a rhythmic motif. So, and it happens to be related to the pitch as well, going down by steps and then up on the third note. All right, this Schubert. Schumann. All right, sorry about that, Schubert, Schumann, and we'll listen again without me talking over it. Okay, so the contour seems to be ramping down to me. In just two big sub-phrase ideas. And each one, again, kind of like the Mozart, there's a stepwise and then a skip, stepwise and then a skip at the end. I don't sense really a rhythmic motif. One could make a case for it. Not super pervasive in my thought. Here and the range, just a little bit more than an octave. And something contemporary. So again, these are all just half melodies really, because there's just one phrase, and I think these are two phrase melodies. We'll listen to this again. Okay, so this is, I would call it an arc, going to the A and then back down. Okay, and the stepwise motion, little jump there, and a jump there at the very end. The range, again, this is a pure octave here from A to A. And to me, it does not have a rhythm motif. And just this fragment alone is not so very memorable, I think, because it has so many different things going on. But I think when it's complemented with the second half, then it becomes a more meaningful thought, melodic thought. And so just putting these things all together in the idea of dramatic shape. So direction, shape, continuity, tension, release, expectation, and arrival. Okay, so here are the things we've been discussing. And they each can contribute in some ways to the dramatic shape. So for example, how does contour create tension and release? As you build up, usually the highest note is the one that creates the most tension and it's climactic. And then if the contour goes down, then that is usually a signature of repose. Stepwise motion usually are unifying and repose, and then we get tension from larger leaps. The range, a bigger range, is one that creates more intensity, and if it's chosen for a specific instrument to be in this higher register, then usually that is also something that's going to create more tension in a good way. And then a unifying factor could be a rhythmic motif. They can be used for variety as we do variations on it or combine it. So that's a whole concept on its own. All right. So going into the second part of this is expanding motifs into longer design units, building on short melodic ideas. The most famous motif So from those four notes, we all know the tune, Beethoven's Fifth, of course. And in fact, he builds the entire first movement, all just around that same idea over and over again. It has a melodic quality, the descending of the third, but also we call it the knock of fate. And other composers have used this rhythmic idea developed by Beethoven as fate is knocking, and you must answer regardless of your desires or not. So again, it takes a memorable motif to be built into a thematic melody. And it's quite sophisticated how composers would structure a whole melody around this idea of motivic development. And melodic devices, as we will see, are different ways, melodic applications to take a small idea and to make it grow, grow, grow. So the most simple way of taking an idea and making it into a bigger idea is just to repeat it. All right, and this is the Schubert, another example of just pure repetition. All right, a little variation. Okay, so a little bit more complex than just a straight repetition, but just all we did was add some passing tones in here. Let's see, da, dot. So actually a little bit of a cambiata or changing tones up and above, coming down again to the original note. And then again, of a cambiata or changing tones here around the B, the long note, and then the rest is the same. All right, so next idea is imitation. So here we expand by filling in the same sort of pitch ideas in another voice. So that, and then sort of like a canon or a fugue, but it's all part of one idea. So when the focus is on this other voice for melodic ideas, the other part would be a little bit more mellowed out. So not really quite a fugue, but getting along into that sort of realm. So here's a short idea from Beethoven. And more expanded idea by Bach. So this is a way, not necessarily building a melody longer, but by building a piece around, if you more bang for your buck, if you just take the same melodic idea and give it to another voice for a couple of measures. So how does Bach get bang out of his buck? So he takes the melodic idea and then repeats it at a different pitch level. And he does that 3 times. So he takes the original idea and then instead sort a little variation on that, but stepwise, and then jumps down to a B flat instead of the C sharp and up a 7th and down, and then up a 2nd, and then down the 7th again, and up back up and down. So when you take a an idea, and you set the same melodic idea in the same voice, but at a different pitch level. It is called a sequence. Okay, so two or more appearances of the motif, each at a different pitch level, but unlike mere imitation, to be a sequence, the repeated figure must follow the original statement immediately, and it has to be in the exact same voice. So it creates unity, but then when you depart from the sequence, it creates a little variety from that. And usually we follow the rule of 3. You repeat it twice, so you get the original statement 3 times total. Because after that, it's boring, which creates tension in itself, but so we would not want that to necessarily continue to repeat. Usually it's pieces band, but all right, so we're looking just at the right hand, and we can see and we have imitation as well, but the sequence is this idea that then is repeated, except at a lower pitch level, and then repeated again at yet a lower pitch level. Okay, so before we hear this whole Beethoven, so this whole idea is just repeated again for the second phrase, but at a higher pitch level to create, of course, as building towards a climax. So that is really getting bang out of his bug. Just repeat the whole thing, but at a different pitch level. What do we notice that's different about both of these set of sequences? Well, if we look at the amount of accidentals, this is what we call an exact sequence, or REAL, real sequence, because we maintain the exact same intervals as we sequence it. So from F to E, C to B is a half step, and from B to D flat is your augmented third, and then D flat down to C is a half step. And look at the sequenced event. F down to E is a half step, and E up to the G flat is a diminished third, and then G flat down to F is a minor second. In the for Elise, we stay within the same key. So this is called a tonal sequence, where you have the same generic intervals, the same distance, but maybe not precisely. G going up to F is a minor seventh, and then F to E is a major seventh, and then E to D is a minor seventh. So this is called a tonal. Okay, and one is not better than the other. I think we'll see the tonal sequences are much more prevalent because you don't want to be transposing it every time, especially if it's a short little idea. Okay, so Mozart is just taking a scale and expands it, puts it into goes down, down, down. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe we're a little bored by the fourth iteration of of that. And I'm not going to play this because I don't get it. Oops, I'm sorry, I didn't forward the screen for you. All right, so another example of a sequence. Here is Mozart. Okay, so he states it and then repeats it actually. So this is breaks the rule of three, does it 4 times, and we are really ready for it to be in. I think maybe creates a little tension again with the extra repeat. All right, and I'm not going to go into too much detail. Just some different ideas about sequences, different variations of them. I have to make sure I change the slide with the lecture. Okay, so maybe you might notice that this is the Mozart we listened to. We were talking about the contour, and we can see here though that this is very much sequenced, and then the second half of the melody, of course, takes a different approach. And here, Mozart puts together. He has sequence in the right hand and in fact, look at in the right hand, it's here in 2 different parts, and here in the left hand, even in the accompaniment part. So an example of a tonal sequence, because it stays within key. All right, I will not try to play this in the 4 flats. But a real sequence because we have an exact perfect octave going down by a minor second, going down here with the accidental down by a minor second. And is this an exact real sequence? Real sequence, which we're familiar with. Up a step, up a 3 times, and then da. Good job, Rogers and Hammerstein. All right, again, little small differences. So I'll zip through these other expanding ideas. So again, we're talking about different ways you can take a short motif and you can build it into a larger sort of melody or into a composition. Fragmentation is, and these are kind of sophisticated. So fragmentation is taking just a little bit part of a melodic design and repeating it, maybe sequencing that out to build a larger idea. Okay. Interval expansion. So, and we're expanding it to create the tension. Here's we have a jump of a 4th, and then a 5th, and then in an octave, and contraction getting smaller as it repeats. So just keep that in the back of your head, I suppose. So you build a melody, keep the same sort of overall shape, but building, expanding, and contracting the I'm not getting my And these are really sophisticated. And these are things we would see in either a Bach fugue sort of idea, or when things became in the 20th century, we call serial music or 12-tone, where the patterns are perhaps more important than the pitches. So retrograde is when the pitch interval ideas are backwards. So, for example, we start out with a major third, go down by a second, up a perfect fourth, down by a whole step, and up by a perfect fourth. And at the end, up a major third, down by a second, up a perfect fourth, down by a major second, up by a perfect fifth. So it sounds perhaps interesting, but really is. Knows the Hindemith, who you might grow to appreciate. I know I do. He uses it as a fugue, in a fugue statement as well. This is something the audience would not probably pick up on, so it's like a little hidden sort of thing. But here it is 300 years earlier. And then perhaps repeated in the pedals or a second voice. So this is inversion. So we just take the intervals and we put them upside down. So up a fifth, down a fifth, excuse me, up a minor third, up a major third, up a minor second. And here we're going up a fifth. So in the original is up a fifth, down a third, down a third, down a half step. So it's in sort of a mirror. Okay. Augmentation, though, and diminution are fairly popular. So augmentation is when you take a melody and you repeat it, but at a longer rhythmic values. So you augment it. And diminution is when you do it with shorter values. So here it is in imitation and inversion and diminution. So putting the bass clef. And so it's upside down, it's inverted, and it's twice as fast, or half the durational values here. So, and this is, I think, is Bach. For another day, a whole idea though of how Beethoven takes his idea of the descending major third. So just really quickly to reinforce what we just discussed. Okay, when it comes to the end of the development, so that's just exact repetition, does about 5 times. Sequence. So in the same instrument part, does it upside down. Interval contraction and expansion. We heard that some of this already above. So a third. So expansion, and he does it. This is at the very, very end for big impact. A rhythmic metamorphosis. So like in a development, and then the motif is imitated between different instruments. So is in a comic strip idea. So You're, of course, allowed to turn this off whenever you need, but as we reflect in the state of dramatic shape, how do these ideas, how can they be used to build? And how can they be used to repeat? And how will you be using these in your compositions? Because that's just around the corner to write a short melody, 8 measures, and you want to be using these ideas so it's a melody that you really like, because then you're going to be expanding that into your final project. And on that note, farewell, young theorists.